78 years had carved deep lines into Henry Walker's face, but his eyes, steel blue and unblinking, still carried the disciplined fire of a man who once faced death in the jungles of Vietnam. That morning, as he stood at the security checkpoint at Jackson Hole Airport in Wyoming, there was something quietly ceremonial about the way he carried himself. His steps were deliberate, his back stiff despite the persistent ache in his left knee. He had declined assistance when offered a wheelchair. There was pride in pain, he had once told his late wife. Henry wasn't a man given to sentimentality, but today was different. Tucked inside the inner pocket of his jacket was a faded photograph of his granddaughter, Natalie, taken 13 years ago, on the day she declared she would become a naval officer like him. She had been just 9, missing a front tooth, hair in uneven braids, and she'd saluted him with such fierce sincerity that he'd had to look away to keep his throat from tightening. Today, she would graduate from the United States Naval Academy, the first woman in the Walker line to wear the uniform. He had booked his flight 3 months ago, checking and rechecking every detail. Seat 14C. Ill seat. Extra legroom. Close enough to the front that he wouldn't need to walk too far. His doctor had insisted, the knee won't hold if you're boxed in too long. Henry had nodded in agreement, though he'd said nothing about the cold sweats he sometimes woke up with, dreams of crouching in rice paddies while bullets whipped through the air. As the boarding gate announced Group 3, Henry stood. He moved slowly, the duffel bag over his shoulder worn but clean, military patches still visible under the faded green fabric. He walked with a quiet kind of dignity, invisible to most, except to the young man with earbuds in who instinctively stepped aside, sensing something different. Boarding the plane always felt a little like entering enemy territory. Tight spaces, uncertainty, people shuffling in ranks. Henry placed his hand briefly on the headrest of 14C before easing into the seat. He exhaled quietly. Small victory. The knee would hold. He would see Natalie in uniform. Through the narrow window, the snow-covered Tetons stretched into the distance. He watched them for a moment, heart swelling with an emotion he hadn't named in years. Not pride. Not exactly joy either. Something deeper. Something sacred. But as the last passengers boarded and the overhead bins clicked shut, Henry felt something shift. Not outside, but in the subtle current of the cabin. The way the flight attendants moved, a hesitation in their smiles, and then the voice. Calm but firm. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to switch seats." He turned. The young woman in uniform was speaking to him, professionally, but without softness. "There's a family who needs to sit together. We need your seat." Henry blinked, as if trying to translate her words through another language. His seat. The plane had not yet left the ground, but something inside him already had. Henry stared at the flight attendant as if the words hadn't quite settled into his ears. For a second, the hum of the aircraft, the rustle of jackets and luggage, and the murmured conversations around him all seemed to dissolve into static. The request, calm, courteous, logical, was still hanging in the air, but it struck something raw beneath his skin. "There's a family who needs to sit together," she repeated gently, offering an apologetic smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "They have a child with special needs. We'd really appreciate it." He turned to glance down the aisle. A young mother, perhaps in her 30s, stood a few rows back holding the hand of a little boy, no older than 6. The child clung to her leg, his face pale and twitching with agitation. Behind them, the father looked on, sheepish, trying to soothe the baby wriggling in his arms. Henry understood the situation instantly. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't unfair. It wasn't even unreasonable. But it felt like an undoing. He had booked this seat with care, with intention, with the quiet reverence of a man who did not take comfort for granted. This wasn't just a seat. It was a promise. It was the steadying certainty that he could make the trip, knee intact, dignity preserved, and witness the one moment in years that mattered. His lips parted to respond, but the words caught, trapped between his pride and his politeness. He looked back at the attendant. She was young, younger than Natalie. There was kindness in her tone, But there was also that trained airline efficiency, that subtle pressure which tells you there's only one acceptable answer. He inhaled through his nose. His knee was already beginning to throb, as if it too sensed the change. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice dry as parchment. "I have a medical condition. I booked this seat specifically." The woman's smile dimmed just a shade. She nodded, understanding, but something in her shifted, as though she had expected him to comply. She knelt slightly, trying another angle. "I understand, sir, but we're trying to help a family. It would mean a lot." Henry's eyes flicked once more toward the boy, who now whimpered softly and buried his face in his mother's coat. The mother mouthed a silent "thank you" across the rows, as if assuming the matter was settled. And in that moment, Henry felt the familiar pressure of duty, the same kind he had carried in the jungle when he'd volunteered to lead a patrol no one wanted, the same kind that made him hold back his tears at every funeral, every folded flag handed to every widow. He had never learned how to say no when the cause felt noble, even if it hurt, even if it wasn't fair. He gave a slight nod. "All right." Relief passed across the attendant's face. She helped him up as gently as she could, but the act itself felt brutal. He grabbed the overhead bin for support as his knee wobbled. The boy's eyes met his, for just a moment, wide, searching, perhaps sensing the invisible cost. They guided him to a middle seat, row 27, squeezed between a man in a hoodie who reeked of cheap cologne and an elderly woman reading a dog-eared romance novel. There was no legroom, no silence, no view. He sat down carefully, folding his long frame into a space built for smaller lives. The plane door closed. The engine hummed to life. And as the aircraft began to taxi, Henry stared straight ahead, hands folded over the photo of Natalie in his coat pocket. The pain in his knee was sharp now, but sharper still was the slow realization creeping in like winter chill. After a lifetime of sacrifice, even now he was expected to yield. And he had. Again. The woman in 13A had noticed him the moment he boarded. There was something in the way he walked, rigid but not weak, measured but not uncertain, that set him apart from the stream of passengers shuffling past with backpacks and earbuds. She was the kind of traveler who rarely paid attention to others. Airports were full of noise, and she had grown used to tuning it out, focusing on her book, her breathing, her carefully curated detachment. But when the older man with the stiff back and weathered face passed by, something in her stilled. She had seen men like him before. Not often. And not up close. She couldn't have guessed his name was Henry, or that he was on his way to see his granddaughter step into the same world he had once belonged to. But there was a certain dignity in the way he lowered himself into 14C, a ritual kind of gravity that made her eyes flick up from her page. He sat without complaint, hands resting calmly on his knees, gaze fixed out the window. And then the uniformed attendant came. The exchange had been soft-spoken, but clear enough to those nearby. From her seat, the woman in 13A watched it unfold with the quiet, helpless tension of someone witnessing a slow disassembly. It wasn't loud. No conflict. No raised voices. Just the careful language of compromise, dressed as courtesy. She heard him explain, "I have a medical condition." Heard her persist, "It would mean a lot." There was a pause. And then he stood. She watched his hand reach for the overhead bin for balance, fingers curling just a bit tighter than they needed to. She saw his wince, quickly masked. She noticed the way his eyes flicked toward the child, the same instinctive glance her own father used to give, like measuring whether pain was a worthy trade for someone else's comfort. When he was led down the aisle, back toward the cramped rows and stale air of coach, something in her shifted. She turned in her seat as far as the belt would allow and caught a glimpse of him settling into 27B, shoulders drawn in, elbows tucked like a man trying to disappear inside a body too big for the space. And then came the murmurs. He could have just said no. Well, it was for a kid, wasn't it? Old man should have been more understanding. The words weren't cruel. Not really. Just casual. The kind of small judgments people made when they didn't want to feel uncomfortable. But she had seen enough to know better. She had seen the restraint in his silence, the fatigue in his bones, the way he carried something more than luggage. The plane took off, and the clouds swallowed the window. Somewhere behind her, in a narrow seat near the toilets, the man who had given up more than just a bit of legroom was sitting quietly, nursing his thoughts like old bruises. And in 13A, the woman couldn't quite focus on her book anymore. The paragraphs blurred. She didn't know his name. She didn't know the pain in his knee or the weight of his memories. But she did know what it looked like when a person was asked to shrink so others could stretch out. She knew what it meant when someone gave way, not because they had to, but because they always did. And for the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. Quiet shame. Strange reverence. And the thought that maybe, when the flight landed, she might walk back to row 27, not to offer thanks but simply to say, "I saw you." From the cockpit the world felt smaller, compressed into dials, coordinates, and controlled voices over headsets. But Captain Elias Marlowe had always believed that flying wasn't just about physics and navigation. It was about people, the lives packed into rows behind him, each with their own reasons for being here. Weddings, funerals, fresh starts, quiet goodbyes. He had learned to read the cabin through a kind of sixth sense, honed over decades in the air. And that day something felt off. It started as a murmur through the intercom line from the senior flight attendant, Nora, tight-lipped and clipped in her phrasing. There had been a situation, she said, regarding the seat reassignment in row 14. A request had been made for a child and her mother to be moved forward, closer to the lavatory, away from the back row din. The elderly man in 14C had initially refused. Politely but firmly. Medical reasons, he'd said. Something with his back and knees. But eventually, without a word of protest, he gave up the seat. Elias listened in silence. A long silence. Not the distracted kind. He wasn't the type to multitask human emotion while adjusting altitudes. No, he listened the way a father does when his child doesn't know how to ask for help. He didn't know the man's name. That hadn't come up. But something about the way Nora described him, the controlled stillness, the quiet compliance, tightened a string inside Elias that hadn't been touched in years. He had seen this before. Not the incident itself, but the pattern. The way some passengers moved through the world like they were trespassing in it. How dignity sometimes manifested as silence, as a refusal to complain. How certain people, often the kindest, often the most burdened, were asked to bend because others assumed they could take it. And somewhere between cruising altitude and the silence of a sky full of cloud, Elias felt something he didn't feel often anymore. Anger. Not the kind that boiled, but the kind that settled like weight in his chest. He thought of his own father, who'd once stood in a crowded train for 2 hours so a pregnant woman could rest her swollen ankles. Who never told anyone about his hip pain, not even when it kept him awake at night. He thought of how easily we all talked about sacrifice, and how rarely we saw it when it was done quietly. The aircraft hummed around him, steady and unbothered. But inside the cockpit something shifted. Elias pressed the intercom button, requested Nora to return when possible. She arrived moments later, eyebrows raised, half expecting a routine update. He didn't speak immediately, just looked at her, his voice calm but firm. "Where did you move the gentleman?" 27B, she replied. "Was. Middle seat. Near the rear galley." Elias nodded once. "Move him back." Nora hesitated, glancing at the console, then back at him. "Sir, the mother and child. He paid for that seat. Medical accommodation. We honor those. He shouldn't have had to give it up to begin with." She started to explain. Passenger comfort, the mother's request, the optics of turning the situation around mid-flight. But Elias raised a hand, not harshly, just enough. "If we're going to ask people to trust us at 30,000 feet, then we sure as hell better be the kind of people who deserve that trust." It wasn't about protocol. Not this time. "Go talk to him," he said, quieter now. "Apologize. Bring him forward. And if the mother and child need assistance, we'll handle that too. Differently." But no one should be punished for being too polite to say no. Nora looked at him for a long moment, then nodded, and turned to walk the length of the cabin. Elias watched her go, then returned his attention to the horizon, steady and vast. He didn't need applause, and he certainly didn't expect the passengers to know what had just happened. But somewhere in row 27, a man would return to his seat, not out of pity, but because someone finally said, "You mattered enough to stay where you belonged." And in the silence of the cockpit, with the clouds parting ahead, Elias allowed himself the smallest breath of peace. Not because the world was fair, but because today, in this small metal tube hurtling across the sky, it had been made just a little more right. Nora had walked these aisles countless times in her 18 years of service, but few moments had made her feel as strangely exposed as this one. The weight of the captain's words lingered with her as she moved past rows of passengers now lulled by the rhythm of flight, sleeping, reading, watching tiny glowing screens. None of them knew what she was about to do. None of them would likely notice. And yet, in her chest, her heart beat as though she were walking onto a stage under two bright lights. Row 27 was near the back, close to where the engine hum was strongest and the cabin air a little cooler. It was the kind of row people endured, not enjoyed. She found the elderly man, still seated upright in 27B, hands folded gently over his lap. His posture remained formal, as if he hadn't allowed himself the comfort of slumping even after hours in the air. He stared ahead, eyes not vacant but inward, somewhere between memory and surrender. "Sir," she said softly, kneeling to his eye level. He turned to her, polite, attentive. "I'm terribly sorry for the earlier inconvenience. Captain Marlowe has asked me to offer you your original seat back, in row 14. There was a flicker behind his eyes. Surprise, perhaps disbelief. But he didn't speak. Nora waited. "Why?" he asked finally, voice low, like a man afraid of misunderstanding kindness. She wanted to say, "Because you mattered more than we showed. Because your silence shouldn't have cost you dignity." But instead she simply answered, "Because we were wrong to move you without ensuring it was truly your choice." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced down the aisle, as though trying to see row 14 from here, though it was far beyond sight. After a few quiet seconds he nodded, then began gathering his things slowly. No rush, no bitterness. Just the same quiet grace with which he had surrendered the seat in the first place. Nora offered to help with his small carry-on bag, but he declined gently. It wasn't pride, it was habit. His whole demeanor shaped by decades of not wanting to impose on others. As they walked forward together, a few passengers glanced up, curiosity faint on their faces, but no one said anything. When they reached row 14, the mother and child had already been discreetly moved by another attendant, relocated to a pair of window seats farther forward where they now sat more comfortably, with coloring books spread across the tray table. The man paused at his old seat, 14C. It was still warm from the life briefly lived in it by someone else. He eased into it with the same quiet solemnity he carried with him everywhere, and for a moment, just a brief one, closed his eyes. Not in fatigue but in something else, recognition perhaps. Of himself, of a life where people noticed. Nora watched him buckle his seatbelt again, then gently touched his arm. "Thank you," she whispered. He blinked, confused. "For being gracious. And for allowing us the chance to make it right." He smiled, not broadly, not theatrically. Just enough to soften the years etched into his face. And then he looked out the window, as if only now allowing himself to enjoy the view that once belonged to him. Farther up, the captain remained at the controls, and the aircraft continued its path through the clouds. The passengers settled again. But something had shifted, however invisibly. A small correction had been made, not to the flight plan, but to something far more important, the quiet acknowledgement of dignity. Sometimes rearranging a seat was just logistics, but sometimes it was restitution. And for those few rows filled with strangers and silent lives, it mattered. The hours bled on. Overhead lights dimmed to a soft, ambient hush, the cabin now cloaked in the kind of twilight that dulled both thought and time. Somewhere over the Atlantic, with night cradling the fuselage like a secret, the silence inside felt not empty, but full, of breath, of emotion unspoken, of moments that had passed between people who might never meet again. Nora stood near the galley at the rear, sipping lukewarm tea, her mind still lingering on row 14. She'd checked on the elderly man once since the reassignment, just a quiet walk by, but he had been settled, finally asleep, his head tilted gently toward the window, lips slightly parted in the unguarded way children and the truly exhausted sometimes slept. But even now something tugged at her. Not guilt, no, that had already been faced, acknowledged, but something more elusive. The ache of knowing that sometimes you couldn't give people back what they'd lost. Only offer a softer place to sit with the memory of it. The intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." Marlowe's voice, calm and worn smooth by repetition, rippled gently through the cabin. "We'll be beginning our descent into Toronto shortly. Local time is 5:47 a.m. We thank you for flying with us tonight." As the announcement ended, overhead lights blinked gently back to life. Seatbelts clicked into place. Blankets were folded, trays stowed. The usual rituals of arrival began, but this time they felt different. Like the end of a long, unscripted play. Everyone had their part, whether they knew it or not. Nora made one last walk down the aisle, her footsteps quiet on the carpet. She slowed as she reached row 14. The man was awake now, gazing out at the faint light breaking along the horizon. A sliver of orange had begun to bloom across the clouds, soft like breath on a mirror. She paused beside him, unsure if she should speak. But he turned, as if sensing her thoughts. "I never told anyone," he said quietly. His voice was not broken, but it carried weight, the kind that settled in the chest. "Why I needed that seat. Why the window." Nora said nothing, just listened. "My wife," he continued, "always took the window. Every trip. 42 years. She liked watching the clouds as we ascended. Said they reminded her of the dreams she didn't chase." He exhaled a short, dry laugh. "I took the aisle. Always the aisle." His eyes glistened, but not from tears alone. "Today would have been her birthday. I thought maybe if I sat there, on her side, I could remember how it felt. Like she was still beside me." Nora swallowed hard, words caught in her throat. He smiled gently at her silence, understanding more than he let on. "You made it possible," he added. "It wasn't just a seat." As the plane dipped lower into the morning light, the city below began to take shape, tiny lights blinking awake, highways pulsing like arteries. Life continuing, people returning. And in row 14C, a man carried something heavier than luggage, but lighter than grief, a small moment of grace. The landing came smooth and quiet, as if the aircraft itself understood the delicacy of what it held. Passengers stood, stretched, retrieved their bags. Nora helped where needed, offering tired smiles. But when the man reached the door, ready to step off into the dawn, he paused once more. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't need to. He simply nodded at her, slow and grateful, and then walked into the new day. His posture a little straighter, his shadow no longer alone. And Nora watched him go, a soft ache blooming behind her ribs, not of sorrow, but of something more redemptive. The reminder that sometimes, even in midair, even among strangers, we are given second chances, to see, to listen, and to make something right. It had been just a flight, just a seat, but it had changed everything.